This is reflection 3 in T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday. I'll call this Theology and the Tragic. I have mentioned previously that when T.S. Eliot turned to Christianity, he turned to the Anglican form of Christianity. Essential to that Anglican form of Christianity is, in fact, the Book of Common Prayer. Now, people can often question elements of the Book of Common Prayer, particularly the 39 articles, and elements of the Anglican tradition has been torn on that particular question. But the essence of the prayer book is to center people through morning, midday, and evening prayer in terms of reflecting on what is before them as they approach the day. Midday prayer, one looks back and says, where was I sensitive, not sensitive to people, to situations? And then the end of the day, evening prayer is similar to a Jesuit examen. We reflect on what we have lived from and how we perhaps in thought, word, and deed could have approached our living situation differently. Now, T.S. Eliot, we'll see in Ash Wednesday, and particularly in section 3, he is drawing from the prayer of humble access as one approaches the sacrament, but he's doing a very interesting thing with that. And when I get to the end of this reflection, this will become, I think, clear. But to section 3 then in Ash Wednesday, I will read and then reflect a little bit on it, noting that the image or the dominant metaphor in section 3 is the Ascent metaphor, which we find in the mothers and fathers of the classical era of Christianity. We get it going back to Moses, the ascent to Sinai. We get Thomas Merton's ascent to truth. And so the image of ascending from the gray, the cloudy life in the valley to the eternal blue sky of truth, it's a common metaphor, but that ascent is also fraught with many challenges, struggles, distractions. And in section 3 of Ash Wednesday, in fact, Eliot names some of those that the pilgrim, as it were, the searcher, the person trying to live in a deeper, more mature understanding of faith, has to be attuned and alert to on their journey. I might also add Ash Wednesday, which then leads into Lent. Many people, when they think of Lent, they think of, well, we're not going to eat meat, we're not going to smoke, we're not going to drink, we're not going to have chocolate. These are all silly, in one sense, ridiculous things. But underlying it is the question of, what are some of my addictions? What are some of my attachments? What are some of my erratic desires that have to be faced into? And a part of Lent, this is why we have the cross on our forehead. We are to die to those elements, and just not the objects that a person is drawn to, but the very element within them that is doing the drawing itself, and the dying to that in that sense. Because Lent, as is Ash Wednesday, which anticipates it, is about letting go, about dying to what we are not, so we may be free to be who we're meant to be, bearers of the image and likeness of God in that sense. And so in section 3, what Eliot is doing, he's highlighting the nature of the ascent from what we are not to be, and some of those struggles, and naming them as we climb up the mountain or the staircase into the blue dome of light and truth and reality, similar in many ways to Plato's cave, moving from the cave into the bright light of the sun in the clear sky. But it is a journey, just as Dante himself, from the Inferno through the Purgatorio to the Paradiso. And so what Eliot is doing, he's drawing from a variety of sources. But let me turn to section 3 as I do this. At the first turning of the second stair, so we already have the sense that the poet is turning upward. He's going upstairs, leaving behind what he once was and moving upward into what he might be, and yet not fully aware of what that actually is. But there is the upward ascent. There is the turning in the second stair. He's left the first stair behind of things that once he was addicted to, attached to, but must be left behind. So at the first turning of the second stair, I turned and saw below. So there's this looking back on the life once lived, the detours, distractions, misguided longings that were once a part of the journey, but in fact have been left behind. I turned and saw below the same shape twisted on the banister, so that earlier part of the journey being pulled in two on the ship of multiple longings and desires conflicting, and who is the self in the midst of all of this? The same shape twisted on the banister. There's not a center, there's not a core to what a person is meant to be in their faith. Under the vapor and the fetid air, and so there's a lack of clarity, a lack of insight as the ascent is made. One can sense there's something more, but they're in a whiteout in many ways. Struggling with the devil of the stairs who wears the deceitful face. Very important here. For example, we get in Shakespeare, a person can smile and still be a villain, or false face doth hide, but false heart doth know. C.S. Lewis, probably his most important novel, Till We Have Faces. It's often in the face of another that we are either convinced or we're not convinced. They draw us in or they do not draw us in. In patristic thought, the face was very, very important in terms of the face is a reflection of the soul. And what do the eyes, what did the face reveal that tells us something about the soul? But here the deceitful face of, and this is very important, of a dualism which is a dangerous dualism, the deceitful face of hope. Now there's hope for good things which can give life, but there's also false hopes. We can turn to things in life we think are going to give us hope, think are going to give us meaning, but in fact they can betray us, and that can be religion, it can be politics, it can be intellectual life, it can be relationships, it can be a whole range of anything we turn to. If I just have this, or if I just have that, but once we have it, restless once again, emptiness once again. So the deceitful face of hope, but it's a form of hope that betrays the soul. And then the flip side of betrayed hope is then often despair. So the deceitful face of hope and despair. And many people in their journey get torn to and fro between, as Shakespeare would say, hope springs eternal in the human breast. But often what we turn to from hope can in fact betray, deceive us. And then, as I said, what often happens when people naively and indiscriminately put faith in something or hope in something that lets them down, then they slip into despair, cynicism, skepticism. And this polarization, darkness, will constantly work on and play. Feed people a mirage of a certain type of hope. Once they see that, in fact, the mirage is not reality, then bitterness, then despair, then cynicism. But people can only live so long in the despair, and then if they're not grounded in something deeper, they turn again to false hope, or what we would call the deceitful face, as Eliot says. So this tension in the lower stairs, in which people are pulled to and fro by shallow hope, then despair, Eliot, many ways, points very clearly to this tension and dilemma, which leads to impotence. It leads to paralysis of the soul. But in the stairs moving upward, this is something in the lower stairs that a person has to face into. What is the unnecessary tension I'm living with in terms of hope in the wrong things, and then despair that follows, and then a return to shallow hope, and then despair. So the question is, what are things really worth hoping for that do not lead to despair in that sense? or a tragic outcome in which a person, as Rilke says, goes round and round in the smallest circle turns. And this hope and despair is itself a form of living in the cave of the soul, in which darkness dominates and the light is forever obscure. And so as Eliot, the poet, ascends these stairs, he wants to hope, but to hope for something that is not going to lead to despair, and then shallow hope again, this to and fro, in which there in fact is no growth or maturation. Now, as he moves into the second stanza, he actually is probing this more fully, where it actually leads in terms of the soul, in terms of a deeper darkness. So at the second turning of the second stair, I left them twisting, turning below. So the soul does twist and turn when it's not properly centered, when it probably does not live from the core. When we hit four quartets, perhaps in a few months, we can see Eliot is constantly trying to gravitate to what he calls the still point in the moving world. And when a person doesn't find that, there's this twisting and turning below. And how do we move beyond that below the lower level of the soul's ascent to the higher level? Because the poet is always asking, who was I that did not fulfill, and who might I be as I continue to descend that I'm not quite aware of yet? But we do know the lower level, between hope and despair, there is this constant, there's twisting and turning below. There were no more faces. So even the alluring element that once one could be tricked by, fooled by, deceived by, there were no more faces, and the stair was dark. So a person enters into a place they do no more know how to navigate. The North Star, in that sense, is gone. The stars are gone. The moon is gone. The sun obviously has disappeared. And so there's this deeper descent into the darkness of the soul of paralysis. And as I mentioned earlier, impotence. And so this becomes a tragedy of a person who does not want to face into those issues, and then increasingly their story that unfolds in a sad and tragic way, part of the tragic flaw of a person not dealing with these issues in their lives. It was damp, jagged, like an old man's mouth, driveling beyond repair. So Eliot has a way of graphically articulating what becomes of the soul that in fact is trapped and chained in terms of a narrow understanding of what freedom is, what hope is. And in fact, there is this deterioration, similar in many ways. If one has watched Harry Potter, at the end where you would see Voldemort's body shrunken in many ways, and it's a pathetic sight as it's almost in a fetal position in which life is increasingly deteriorating as he goes from darkness to shrinking to shriveling. And in that sense, what Eliot is depicting in this poem is that very thing, or the toothed gullet of an aged shark. So then he moves on to stanza 3, and this is the temptation, inevitably, a more subtle temptation, an alluring temptation, given the fact that disorientation in the dark can be painful. It's how does no one wants to live in a place in which they know more how to navigate, similar to Dante's entering the dark wood, and where are the clearings? How do I find light anymore? So at the first turning of the third stair, so here we have 3 again, which of course is the Trinity, which Eliot is alluding to, and as well as the Trinity of the soul also, and how the Trinity of the soul can, in fact, be deceived, betrayed also. At the first turning of the third stair was a slotted window, bellied like the fig's fruit. So all of a sudden, out of the darkness, there's a little light. There's an ability to look down on what might be life, what may hold the despairing heart, soul, and mind, what might be attractive, what may lead into more meaningful places. And beyond the hawthorn blossom and the pasture, see, these are all attractive. These are all alluring. And a person in despair and darkness, how could they not but long for this aestheticism, the sensuality, the sexuality, the beauty of it all? in the midst when everything seems pointless, aimless, empty, nausea, as Jean-Paul Sartre would say. In a pasture scene, the broad-backed figure dressed in blue and green, obviously blue and green. Blue is the sign of eternity, the blue canopy, green a color of fecundity and life. So when a person is living in a dark night of the soul, a painful place, fecundity and life and light cannot help but ease and yet this can be deceptive also, because darkness will often appear as an angel of light. Enchanted the Maytime with an antique flute, blowing hair is sweet, brown hair over the mouth blowing, lilac and brown hair. Who cannot be taken by these images, attractive, powerful, evocative? And yet what does he say? Distraction. So when we hit four quartets, one of the most provocative and lines is the danger of being distracted by distraction through distractions. So this is a distraction. This actually, rather than taking people higher up the stairs, in fact, will lead them to yet another painful, tragic, dark place, the tragic flaws for those who do not want to face into those elements in their soul that are not dealt with. Inevitably, there are serious consequences. Music of the flute stops and steps of the mind over the third stair. So here you have the mind, which is important. Sometimes, in fact, it is the mind that has to overcome the imagination of fantasies. And so Eliot is hinting here is that when there are these imaginative allures and attractive things, it is mind over the third stair, fading. Strength, here's the will. So it's just not the mind that can lead a person beyond. You have to have the strength beyond hope and despair. So what's the role of the mind and the will of finally overcoming this temptation of a certain form of aestheticism, sensuality, and then the temptation to return to false hope and despair, climbing the third stair? So there's an effort here in which strength, the will, is needed, in fact, and the mind to overcome this and to move yet higher. Now, this is where it gets interesting. As I mentioned earlier, Eliot was very drawn to the Book of Common Prayer, and particularly the means of soul formation in the Book of Common Prayer through morning, midday, and evening prayer. At the weekly Eucharist or Mass, in the prayer of humble access, we say, Lord, I am not worthy. Lord, I am not worthy. And so what you have is this tension here between, on the one hand, the unworthiness of the false self that turns to these things that in fact leads to despair, and yet the worthiness of who we are deep down, bearing the image of God. But here you get a very interesting element of what Eliot's doing in this particular passage, drawn from the prayer of humble access. In the Mass, he says, Lord, I am not worthy. Lord, I am not worthy, but speak the word only. But at that point, there's silence. Usually in the prayer of humble access, and within this, drawn from the Gospels, says, but speak the word only, and I shall live, or I shall be healed. Now, Eliot leads that silently. What happens in the human journey when, in fact, there are women and men who are trying to ascend yet further into the third stair, into the life of God, and yet they experience suffering, they experience tragedy. It can be illnesses, it can be war like we're experiencing in the Ukraine at the present time, or what other people suffer in this world, debilitating diseases. You can have men and women who have really dealt with these internal issues and they're wanting to live more significantly. Now, we have traditions in Western literature, the comedic element, in which where you have women and men trying to live with integrity. They faced into these challenges of the agon, and the ending is happy. We look at Lord of the Rings, for example. Middle Earth is redeemed. Star Wars programs. Evil is overcome. The Sith is defeated. Chronicles of Narnia, the Narnians in Aslan win. Harry Potter, those who struggle with integrity end up dealing with evil in that sense. But what happens on the other hand, where you have women and men who are engaged in these struggles, in which in fact they do not win at the end? In fact, there's illnesses, there's killings, there's injustices, there's war. And it's interesting what Eliot does with this. These are the tragedies not of a tragic flaw in someone, but in fact, what seems to be God's absence, silence, eclipse in the midst of going up the stairs of trying to live more meaningfully. And just as in the previous stanza, Eliot lives in this tension, a variety of tensions, as I mentioned in the previous reflection. There is a silence here. She's not going to say, Lord, I am not worthy, but speak the word only. There's silence. He's not going to say, and I shall live or shall be healed. In fact, there is this tension between the comedic and the tragic. And he's not there to give an answer to that. And in that silence by Eliot, just as in the previous stanzas, there are these tensions. And in Ash Wednesday Lent itself, we go through crucifixion and resurrection. But many people's stories are not ones of resurrection. In fact, they live in the tragic state of what seems to be perpetual crucifixion. And so Eliot's not going to offer an optimistic, a resurrection story, but he's not going to offer a pessimistic one either. We tend to get in Christianity the tension between the theology of the cross and the theology of glory. Both are true and not true. And Eliot ever lives in these dynamic tensions in which the soul is formed and shaped on the anvil of life itself, in which there are no guarantees of the ending. And he has the integrity in this stanza to but speak the word only, then silence. Because the actual answer is not certain in the process of what Ash Wednesday and Lent leads to, and then finally the crucifixion in which we are to die in Christ. But the resurrection in Christ is obviously not the same as the resurrection of Christ. We resurrect in the life of the church, but in that process of being resurrected, there is as much the comedic, the positive, good things happening, as well as the world of the tragic, the world of suffering, of misunderstandings, of people not hearing and heeding one another. So stanza 3 is very, very much a key stanza in which he builds on section 2 and living in a tension of mystery. And it is in this mystery in which no simple answers are given. So in a sense, section 3 is the shortest section in Ash Wednesday, and yet it has a congealed power and wisdom and insight to it, which in one sense can take much of our lives to fully unpack and reveal as we live our journey in the context of the life of the church and of the world itself.